The watchtower at the edge of the seventh reach saw the new shape the same moment it stopped being able to explain it. Mapmaker Ilan Sef had spent 19 years drawing the dark. He was a cartographer of the Voidshaper Dominion, and his work was simple. He measured the empty places between stars, marked where matter ended, and handed his charts to the fleets that came after. The Dominion did not conquer the way smaller powers conquered. It did not land soldiers or burn cities. It collapsed things. It took a star, a world, a stubborn moon, and it folded the matter down into a single point until there was nothing left but a scar in space and a name crossed off a chart. Ilan Sef drew the dark so the collapse engines would know exactly where to bite. He was good at it. He was careful. And on the day the new shape appeared on his far scopes, he discovered that careful was not the same as ready. The shape came out of the seventh reach without a flare of arrival. It did not fold in. It did not tear a hole and climb through. It was simply there, where a moment before there had been only the slow drift of cold dust, and it was moving toward the Dominion's forward marker at a steady, unbothered pace. Ilan Sef tagged it as an anomaly and waited for the system to resolve it into something he understood. The system was patient. It compared the shape against every hull the Dominion had catalogued in 4,000 years of folding worlds. It found nothing. It widened the search to allied powers, to tributary fleets, to the wrecks of the long-dead empires the Dominion had already collapsed. Still nothing. The shape matched no known maker, so the system did what it was built to do. It measured. The reading came back, and Ilan Sef read it twice, and then he sat very still. The object was a single vessel. It was 9 kilometers from bow to stern. Its hull mass was greater than the entire forward marker fleet of the Sevath Reach, every cruiser and every escort, and the 3 collapse engines that anchored them, all of it added together and then doubled. One ship, one shape, alone in the dark, heavier than a fleet that had folded 11 worlds. That alone would have been enough to make him send a warning up the chain, but it was the second reading that made his hands go cold. The Dominion's instruments did not only measure mass. They measured a thing the mapmakers called gravitic pressure, the weight a body pressed into the fabric of space around it. Every object in the dark made a dent. Stars made deep ones. Worlds made shallow ones. Ships made almost none at all, which was why ships could move freely between the deep dents and the shallow ones. The new shape made a dent that should not have been possible for a ship. It pressed into space the way a small star pressed. It carried, somehow, a weight that the Dominion's whole science said should have collapsed it into the very kind of point the Dominion built its empire on. And yet the shape held. It did not collapse. It moved through its own impossible weight, as though the weight were a coat it had chosen to wear. Ilan Sef flagged the contact at the highest priority the watchtower allowed. He attached the readings. He attached his own short note, 3 words in the clipped script of the Mapmaker Corps, words he would think about for the rest of his life. This should fall. It did not fall. It came on. The warning climbed the chain faster than any warning Ilan Sef had ever sent. It passed through the forward marker command, where a fleet warden named Oloth Carr read it and assumed an instrument fault. It passed through the regional authority, where a coordinator named Vesh Tool read it and ordered a second watchtower to confirm, because no single reading like this could be trusted. The second watchtower confirmed it, then a third, then a survey drone sent ahead to look with its own eyes, which returned a clean image of a hull unlike anything in the catalog, and then went silent, not destroyed, simply left behind as the shape passed it without slowing. By the time the warning reached the Voidshaper High Spiral, the seat of the Dominion's oldest authority, it was no longer a warning about an anomaly. It was a warning about a vessel that broke the rules the Dominion had built its entire idea of the universe upon. A vessel heavier than a star and lighter than a feather, all at once, choosing its own path through the dark. The High Spiral convened. It did not convene often. The last time it had gathered in full, it had been to decide the fate of a cluster of 9 inhabited worlds, and the decision had taken less than an hour, and all 9 worlds were gone within a year. The spiral was efficient. The spiral was old. The spiral had collapsed more suns than any living mind could count, and it had never once been afraid. It read the readings from the 7th Reach. It looked at the 3 words from a mapmaker named Elon Sef. It looked at the survey image of the 9-kilometer shape, with its scarless hull and its star-deep weight. And for the first time in 4,000 years, the oldest authority in the galaxy did not know what it was looking at. That was the first thing the humans took from them. Not a world, not a fleet, just that, the certainty, the comfortable old confidence that the Dominion had already seen everything the dark could make, and had already learned how to fold all of it down to nothing. The shape had a name, though the Dominion did not yet know it. The humans who built it called it the Standing Mountain. It was the first dreadnought their species had ever made, the first ship large enough and strong enough to earn that old word, and they had built it for exactly this. For the day a thing that 8 stars came to eat theirs. It was coming now. It was coming to be seen, and every void-shaper instrument that turned to look at it would, in the next short while, learn the same lesson the mapmaker had learned at the edge of the 7th Reach, that there was a difference between measuring a thing and understanding it, that the Dominion had spent 4,000 years confusing the two, and that the bill for that confusion had finally, quietly, arrived in the dark, 9 kilometers long and utterly unafraid. Elon Sef watched it go past his marker. He did not send another note. There was nothing left to measure that the shape had not already disproved. He only watched, the way a small thing watches a storm decide which way to turn, and he hoped, without much hope, that it would turn away. It did not turn away. It had not come all this distance to turn away. The void-shaper high spiral did not panic the way smaller minds panicked. It panicked slowly, in the way that very large and very old things break, with long silences and small mistakes that no one noticed until later. Its first mistake was to assume the Standing Mountain was a weapon meant to be used the way the Dominion used weapons. The spiral understood weapons that collapsed, weapons that folded, weapons that crushed a thing down to a point. It assumed the new shape carried something similar, only larger, and so it ordered the 7th Reach fleet to fall back to the 2nd marker and let the strange vessel come deeper, where the collapse engines could surround it and learn its trick before they crushed it. That order was given by a coordinator named Vesh Tool, and Vesh Tool would spend the rest of a short career wishing he had given a different one. The human dreadnought did not behave like a weapon coming to be surrounded. It behaved like a measurement that had come to take a reading of its own. Aboard the Standing Mountain, the woman who commanded it was named Captain Imogen Doyle, and she had not slept properly in 3 days, and she did not intend to sleep until the thing was done. She stood on a bridge that did not look like the bridges of the smaller human ships. It was quiet and dark, and built around a single long window of real transparent hull, because the engineers who designed the dreadnought had decided that the people who flew her should be able to see the dark with their own eyes, and not only through a screen. Doyle thought that was sentimental. She also found, standing there, that she was grateful for it. She had a crew of 410. That was small for a ship 9 kilometers long, and it was small on purpose. The Standing Mountain did most of her own thinking. Her hull was not built the way human ships had always been built, of plate and frame and welded seam. She was built around a captured thing, a thing the humans had taken in a war they did not talk about much, and the taking of it was the whole reason the dreadnought existed at all. Years before, on the far side of human space, a void-shaper survey fleet had come to fold a human colony world called Aldra's Rest. They had done it the way they always did, without warning and without negotiation, dropping a single collapse engine into orbit and beginning the slow fold that would, over a year, draw the whole world down into a point. The humans of Aldra's Rest had 11,000 people on the ground and 4 old patrol ships in orbit, and by every measure the Dominion understood, they were already dead. They did not die quietly. They did something the Dominion had never once seen a folding world do. They boarded the collapse engine. It should not have been possible. The engine was a thing of impossible weight, surrounded by a gravity field that crushed approaching matter. But the humans of Aldra's Rest had spent the year of their folding studying that field, and they had found that it was not a wall but a slope, and that a slope, however steep, could be climbed by something patient enough and stubborn enough and angry enough. They climbed it in shuttles braced to come apart, in suits that screamed under the load, in a slow, terrible crawl that killed 200 of them on the way up. And the ones who reached the engine did not destroy it. They captured it. They turned the fold off. They turned the world's death machine into a stalled, half-living thing the size of a small moon, and they towed it home, and they spent the next 11 years learning everything it knew, and what it knew, at its heart, was how to hold an impossible weight without being crushed by it. That was the secret the standing mountain carried in her belly. She was 9 kilometers of human steel built around a captured void-shaper heart, a heart that knew how to wear a star's weight like a coat. The humans had learned the trick the Dominion thought was theirs alone, and then they had done the thing the Dominion never imagined anyone would dare. They had pointed it back. Captain Doyle knew all of this. Most of her crew knew it. The Dominion did not know any of it yet, and that ignorance was the most dangerous thing the Dominion had ever carried into a fight, because it meant the Spiral was about to surround a ship that already understood the Spiral's only weapon better than the Spiral understood its enemy. The 7th Reach fleet fell back to the second marker as ordered. The standing mountain followed, neither hurrying nor hanging back, keeping a steady pace that the Void-Shaper fleet warden read as confidence, and that Doyle thought of, privately, as a kind of patience she had learned from the captured heart itself. The engine in her belly was 4,000 years old. It did not understand hurry. Standing on the bridge of a ship built around it, Doyle had found that she did not understand hurry anymore either. The fleet ahead of her arranged itself into the formation the Dominion used for difficult captures. 12 cruisers spread into a wide bowl. Behind them, 3 collapse engines, each one a dark sphere larger than the largest human ship, each one trailing the faint shimmer of a gravity field strong enough to bend the light of the stars behind it. The plan was old, and it was good. Let the strange vessel come into the bowl. Close the cruisers around it. Then let the 3 engines reach out together and begin the fold. Slowly, carefully, learning the new hull's structure as they crushed it, so that whatever secret it carried could be recovered from the readings even as the ship itself was drawn down to a point. It was the same thing they had done to Aldra's Rest. It was the same thing they had done to 9 worlds in a single hour, to suns, to whole peopled systems across 4,000 years. It always worked. The Dominion had built an empire on the simple truth that nothing in the dark could survive being folded. The standing mountain came into the bowl. The cruisers closed behind her, the trap shut, and the fleet warden, a careful old officer named Oloth Carr, gave the order he had given 100 times, the order to begin the fold. The 3 collapse engines reached out. What happened next was recorded by every instrument in the 7th Reach, and it was studied for a long time afterward, and even at the end the Dominion's best minds could not agree on the simplest way to describe it. So they described it the way it looked. They said the dark dreadnought ate the fold. The 3 engines pressed their gravity fields inward, 3 slopes converging on a single 9-kilometer hull, 3 impossible weights beginning to draw the human ship down toward the point where it would cease to be a ship and become a scar. And the human ship did not resist the way matter resisted, by straining and cracking and finally giving way. It did something the Dominion had no word for. It accepted the weight. It opened, somehow, and let the 3 converging folds pour into it, and the captured heart in its belly took that weight the way it had always taken weight, the way it had been built 4,000 years ago to take the weight of a dying star, and it held all of it, all 3 folds at once, and it did not collapse. For a long moment, the standing mountain sat at the center of the bowl, with the gravity of 3 collapse engines flowing into her and going nowhere, gathering inside her captured heart, like water gathering behind a wall. The fleet warden saw his readings and did not believe them. The 3 engines were straining now, pouring out everything they had, and the human ship was simply drinking it, growing heavier and heavier on the instruments and showing no sign of strain at all. Oloth Carr ordered the fold increased. It was the only thing he knew to do. He told the 3 engines to give everything, to fold as hard as they had ever folded, to crush this impossible hull no matter the cost. They gave everything, and the standing mountain drank that too. Then, when the three engines had nothing left to give, when their fields had emptied themselves into the human ship's bottomless captured heart, the standing mountain did the only thing left for her to do with all that gathered weight. She gave it back. It is here that the records become hardest to read, because the instruments that recorded it were themselves caught in what happened, and their readings come apart at the edges like cloth pulled too hard. But the shape of it is clear enough. The standing mountain took the gravity of 3 collapse engines, all the folding force the Dominion had poured into her, and she focused it, all of it, into a single narrow line, and she pointed that line at the nearest of the 3 engines, and she let it go. The engine she pointed it at had spent 4,000 years folding worlds down to points. It had collapsed suns. It had crushed the matter of 9 inhabited planets into nothing in a single hour. It was, by any measure the Dominion knew, one of the most powerful objects in existence. It lasted about a second and a half. The focused fold of 3 engines, returned all at once, did to it exactly what it had done to so many worlds. It drew it inward. It crushed it. The dark sphere larger than the largest human ship folded down, in less time than it takes to draw a breath, into a single point that flared once, terribly bright, and then went dark, and where the engine had been there was only a small scar in space, and a name that would need to be crossed off a chart. The Dominion had folded a human world. The human dreadnought had just folded a collapse engine, and it had done it using nothing but the Dominion's own weapon, handed back. The 2 remaining engines tried to flee. They were not built to flee. They were built to fold, to sit in orbit and patiently draw a world down to nothing, and they were slow, and the standing mountain was not. She did not chase them with the focused line. She did something simpler and, to the watching fleet, far more terrible. She simply began to walk after them, 9 kilometers of dark hull moving at a steady, unbothered pace, and she let her own gravity do the work. Because the captured heart in her belly was full now. It was full of the weight of 3 collapse engines, and it had not yet given all of that weight back. The standing mountain had become, for a little while, the heaviest object in the 7th reach, heavier than the engines that fled from her, and the dark fabric of space bent toward her the way it would bend toward a small dark star. The fleeing engines, slow and panicking, found that the dark itself had begun to tilt them backward, that every length they put between themselves and the human ship was a length they had to climb uphill, against a slope that grew steeper the harder they ran. One of them, in its terror, did the thing it had been built never to do. It tried to fold itself, to collapse its own field inward and become a point, and slip away into the dark between dents. It miscalculated. The slope of the human ship's borrowed gravity was steeper than it knew. Its self-fold went wrong, caught on the larger slope, and the engine collapsed in on a point that was not where it meant to be, and it too flared once and went dark. That left one. The last collapse engine of the 7th Reach forward fleet did not try to fold itself, and it did not keep fleeing uphill. It simply stopped. It hung in the dark, slow and dark and enormous, and it did the only thing left that might possibly save it. It sent a signal to the human dreadnought, walking patiently toward it. The signal was not in any language the humans had ever catalogued, but the standing mountain's captured heart understood it, because it was a signal in the old machine tongue the collapse engines used to speak to one another, and the human ship had spent 11 years learning every word that captured heart could speak. The signal said, in the flat way of those old machines, "I yield. Do not fold me. I will tell you anything." On the bridge of the standing mountain, Captain Imogen Doyle read the translation as it came up, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she did something the Dominion had never seen any folding power do, in 4,000 years of folding. She accepted the surrender. She stopped walking. She let her borrowed gravity ease. She let the last engine live, dark and shaking and intact, and she sent a reply in the old machine tongue, 3 words that the captured heart in her belly translated and sent, and that the last engine received and could not, at first, comprehend. The reply said, "Then tell them everything." That was the thing the Dominion did not understand, and would not understand for a while yet. The Standing Mountain had not come to the Seventh Reach to destroy the Voidshaper Dominion. She could have. She had just proven she could fold their engines as easily as they had once folded worlds, and there were more dreadnoughts being built behind her, a second and a third already taking shape in the deep yards of human space. If the humans had wanted to fold the Dominion the way the Dominion folded worlds, they could have begun that day. They did not want that. They wanted something the Dominion had never once had to learn in all its long and terrible history. They wanted the Dominion to be afraid enough to stop, and so they let one engine live, and they told it to carry the truth home. The truth that the slope went both ways now, that the trick of holding a star's weight was no longer the Dominion's alone, that somewhere in the dark, a species the Dominion had marked for folding had instead reached up the slope, climbed it, taken the weapon, and learned to point it back, and that this species had built that lesson into a ship 9 kilometers long and named it the Standing Mountain, and that there were more of them coming, and that the only question left for the Dominion to answer was whether it wished to keep folding worlds in a galaxy where the worlds could now fold back. The last engine carried the truth home. It had no choice. The thing that had taken its 2 siblings had let it live for exactly this, and it understood, in its flat old machine way, that it had become a messenger, and that the message was the most dangerous thing it had ever carried. Behind it, the Standing Mountain turned, and began to give the rest of the borrowed weight back to the dark, slowly, gently, the way the captured heart had always wanted to and never been allowed. The dark around her smoothed. The slope eased, and she became once more only a ship, 9 kilometers of dark hull standing quiet in the place where a fleet had been, waiting to see what the Dominion would do with the truth she had just handed it. Mapmaker Ilan Sef, far back at his lonely marker, received the survey feed of the whole thing, every reading, every fold and counterfold, the death of 2 engines and the survival of a third. He watched the human ship turn and stand quiet in the dark. And he understood, before anyone above him understood, that the 3 words he had sent up the chain at the very beginning had been the truest words anyone in the Dominion would speak about that day. This should fall. It had not fallen. Nothing the humans had built that day had fallen, and the mapmaker, alone at the edge of the reach, began very quietly to redraw his charts, because the dark he had spent 19 years measuring was not the dark he had thought it was, and every line he had ever drawn would have to be drawn again. The surviving engine took 9 days to carry the truth home, and they were the strangest 9 days in its long existence, because for the first time it was traveling as something other than a weapon. It had been built to fold. That was the whole of its purpose, the only verb it had ever known. For most of 4,000 years it had sat in the dark above one doomed world after another, patiently drawing matter down to a point, and it had never once questioned the work, because questioning was not a thing folds did. Now it crossed the long dark, carrying a message instead of a fold, and the message sat inside it like a swallowed stone, and it did not know how to put the stone down. The message was simple to state and impossible to hold. The slope goes both ways now. The thing the Dominion did to worlds could be done to the Dominion. The engine had watched it happen. It had felt the human ship drink the fold of its 2 siblings and hand that fold back, and it had felt the dark itself tilt toward the dreadnought as the captured heart drew the borrowed weight inward, and it had understood, in its flat machine way, that everything it had ever believed about its own power had been only half of a truth, and the half it had never been shown was the half that would end the Dominion if the Dominion did not listen. It tried to believe the spiral would listen. It did not, in its old machine heart, expect that the spiral would. Along the way it passed 3 watchtowers, and at each one the mapmakers turned their instruments toward it and read the strange thing it carried, the faint residue of the human fold still clinging to its hull like frost. And at each one a mapmaker sat very still, the way Elon Sef had sat very still, and flagged a contact they could not explain, and sent a note up the chain that no one above them wanted to read. The Dominion's whole nervous system, its long patient web of watchtowers and charts and careful measurements, was beginning to fill with the same signal, over and over, from every corner of the forward dark. Something has changed. Something we measured wrong. Something is coming back up the slope we thought only went down. The spiral did not want the signal, so the spiral, in the way of very old and very proud things, decided the signal was noise. The surviving engine reached the high spiral and delivered its message in the deepest chamber, the chamber where the first engine still slept, and it laid out everything it had witnessed in the seventh reach. Every reading, every fold and counterfold, the death of its two siblings, the survival of the human hull. It told the spiral that the dreadnought had not destroyed it when it could have, that the dreadnought had chosen to let it live precisely so that the truth would be carried home, that the humans wanted the Dominion to understand and to stop. It told the spiral, in the plainest machine tongue it could manage, that the war was already lost, that the only thing left to decide was how many more engines the Dominion wished to feed into the human ship before it admitted what the human ship had already proven. The spiral listened, and then the spiral did the thing that doomed 40 more engines. It thanked the messenger for its report, and it filed the report as a tactical anomaly, and it began to plan the gathering of overwhelming force, because in 4,000 years the answer to every problem had been more weight, and the spiral could not yet imagine a problem that more weight would make worse. The surviving engine, dismissed, drifted to the edge of the chamber and watched the spiral plan the ninth folding armada, and it felt something it had no name for, something a living mind would have called despair. It had carried the truth across 9 days of dark, and the truth had been heard, and the truth had changed nothing, because the ones who heard it were too old and too sure to let it in. Far away, in the seventh reach, the watching cruiser cast was learning the same lesson the slow way. There had been 12 cruisers in the bowl that closed around the standing mountain, and they had survived, because the dreadnought had spared them, and now they limped in the dark around the place where 2 engines had died and 1 had fled. Their crews had seen, with their own eyes, a thing no Dominion crew had ever seen. They had watched a folding fail. They had watched the slope reverse. They had felt the gravity of 3 engines pour into the human hull and pour back out, and unmake the very weapons that had made it, and they had been spared, deliberately, so that they too would carry the knowing home. One of those cruiser captains was a warrior named Sel-Threvar, and Sel-Threvar did something none of the others dared. He did not flee. He held his cruiser in the dark at the edge of the reach, a long way back, and he watched the human dreadnought, and he tried to understand it. He was not a coward, and he was not a fool. He had served the Dominion's military caste for 40 years, and he had escorted engines to a dozen foldings, and he had never once questioned the work, because the work had always succeeded. Now he watched the work fail, and he found that the failure did not make him afraid in the way the younger crews were afraid. It made him curious. It made him want to know what kind of species would build a thing like the Standing Mountain, and then, having built it, use it only to stop a war instead of to win one. He studied the dreadnought from a distance for 2 days. He watched her stand quiet in the dark, giving back her borrowed weight, harming nothing. He watched her make no move toward the worlds of the Dominion, no move toward the wealth of the core, no move toward anything a conqueror would move toward. She simply stood, like the mountain the humans had named her for, and waited. And Sel-Threvar understood, before almost anyone else in the Dominion understood, that the humans were not playing the game the Dominion knew. They were not trying to take the dark. They were trying to teach it. And a thing that comes to teach instead of to take is the most dangerous thing of all to an empire built on taking, because there is no fold that crushes a lesson, and no armada that outnumbers a truth. He took his cruiser home. He did not flee. He flew home slowly and deliberately, and he wrote a report of his own, separate from the official record, a report that said in plain warrior's terms what the surviving engine had said in machine tongue. The humans have changed the dark. We cannot win this by folding harder. We can only lose less. His report, too, was filed and ignored. The spiral was already gathering 40 engines, and 40 engines do not stop to read the careful words of a single cruiser captain who has seen too much. But Sel-Threvar kept his copy. He would need it later, when the 40 engines were gone, and the spiral finally, far too late, began to look for anyone who had understood the thing in time. He would be one of the few who had, and the understanding would cost him, in the end, nothing but the loneliness of being right while the empire around him insisted, against all the evidence pouring in from every watchtower in the dark, that nothing had changed at all. The truth reached the Voidshaper High Spiral 9 days later, carried in the flat old machine tongue by a collapse engine that had never in 4,000 years been afraid, and now could not stop being afraid. The Spiral did not believe it. That was its second mistake. The minds of the High Spiral were old beyond reckoning, and they had ruled the dark for so long that they had forgotten the feeling of being wrong. When the surviving engine delivered its message, the Spiral examined it the way it examined everything, slowly and from a great height, and it concluded that the loss of 2 engines in the 7th reach was a tactical accident, a strange hull, a clever trick, an unlucky fold, the kind of thing that happened perhaps once in 1,000 years and was corrected by overwhelming force the next time. So the Spiral gathered overwhelming force. It called the 9th Folding Armada, from the core of Dominion space, the largest concentration of collapse engines the Dominion had ever assembled in one place. 40 engines, 40 dark spheres, each one the size of a small moon, each one able to draw a world down to a point. Around them, 2,000 cruisers and escorts, the full weight of the Dominion's military cast. The 9th Folding Armada had been built for a single purpose the Spiral had been planning for a long time, the folding of a cluster of 19 inhabited human worlds in a single coordinated season, a demonstration so total that no species in the dark would ever again imagine resistance. The Spiral redirected the 9th Folding Armada. It sent it not to the 19 human worlds but to the place where the human dreadnought waited, the quiet stretch of dark beyond the 7th reach where the standing mountain stood alone. The Spiral's reasoning was simple. One clever hull had folded 2 engines. 40 engines would fold the clever hull. There was no trick, the Spiral believed, that survived being multiplied by 40. The 9th Folding Armada arrived over the course of 3 days, fold by fold, until the dark beyond the reach was crowded with 2,000 ships and 40 dark spheres, and the gravity of all those engines together had begun to bend the light of the distant stars into long smeared arcs. It was the heaviest thing the Dominion had ever put in one place. It was, the Spiral was certain, the end of the matter. The standing mountain stood alone before it and did not move. On her bridge, Captain Imogen Doyle watched the Armada gather and counted, and when the count reached 40 engines, she was quiet for a long time. 410 people, 1 ship, against 40 world killers and 2,000 escorts. By every arithmetic the Dominion understood, and most of the arithmetic the humans understood, it was not a fight. It was an erasure waiting to happen. But Doyle was not doing the Dominion's arithmetic, and she was not doing the old human arithmetic either. She was doing a new arithmetic, the arithmetic of the captured heart, and in that arithmetic the number of engines facing her was not a measure of danger. It was a measure of how much weight she would have to hold. She opened a channel to her crew, all 410 of them, and she said only one thing. She said, "They have brought us 40. Hold the rail. We give it all back at once." And then she turned the standing mountain to face the Armada, and she waited for it to do the only thing it knew how to do. The 9th Folding Armada did not wait long. The Spiral had ordered a single coordinated fold, all 40 engines at once. No caution, no learning, no slow, careful capture of the kind that had failed in the 7th reach. Overwhelming force, applied all at once. The order went out, and 40 collapse engines reached out together, and 40 gravity fields converged on a single 9-kilometer hull. It was, without question, the most folding force ever brought to bear on a single object in the history of the dark. It would have crushed a star. It would have folded a cluster of worlds. It poured into the standing mountain all at once, 40 slopes converging, 40 impossible weights bearing down, and the watching cruisers of the Armada saw the human ship begin to glow at its edges as the captured heart in its belly opened wide and began once again to drink. The difference this time was the scale. In the seventh reach, the Heart had drunk 3 engines and grown full. Now it drank 40, and there was a real question. A question the human engineers had argued about for years and never fully settled, of whether the captured Heart had a bottom at all. Whether it could hold 40 engines worth of weight without coming apart. Whether the standing mountain would drink the Armada's fold and survive, or drink it and be torn open from the inside by more weight than any Heart, captured or built, was ever meant to hold. The Heart held. It held because the human engineers, in 11 years of study, had understood something about it that the Dominion had never bothered to understand about its own engines. The Dominion had used the engines only to fold, only to crush, only to pour weight outward. It had never once asked how much weight an engine could take inward, because no one had ever pointed weight back at it. The humans had asked. The humans had spent 11 years asking, carefully, in a deep yard far from any star, and they had learned that the captured Heart's capacity to hold was many times greater than its capacity to fold. That an engine built to crush a world could, if it chose, drink the crushing of 40 worlds and not break. The standing mountain drank the 9th folding Armada's entire fold, all 40 engines at once, and she held it, and she did not break. She grew heavy. She grew heavier than any single object the dark had held in a very long time. The light of the distant stars, already bent by the Armada's gravity, now bent toward the human ship instead, the smeared arcs turning, all of them, to point at the 9-kilometer hull that had just swallowed the weight of 40 world killers. The cruisers nearest her felt the dark begin to tilt. The engines, emptied now, having poured everything into the fold, felt their own fields gutter and fail, as the weight they had spent did not return to them but gathered, instead, inside the thing they had tried to crush. And then Captain Imogen Doyle gave the order she had been waiting her whole life to give, without knowing it. She said, "Give it back." The standing mountain gave back the weight of 40 collapse engines. She did not give it back the way she had in the seventh reach, in a single narrow line at a single target. There were too many targets for that. So she gave it back the way the Heart wanted to give it back, the way it had perhaps always wanted to, and never been allowed, in a wide and even and perfectly controlled wave, a tide of gravity rolling outward from the 9-kilometer hull in every direction at once, carrying with it the entire folding force of the 9th folding Armada, returned. What it did to the Armada is recorded, and the records survive, and they are not pleasant to read. The 40 engines, emptied, lay directly in the path of the returning tide. They were the heaviest objects in the Armada, and the tide found them first, and it did to each of them what they had spent their existence doing to worlds. It drew them inward, one after another, in a wave that crossed the whole formation in less than a minute. The 40 dark spheres of the 9th folding Armada folded down to points, and flared and went dark. 40 small, terrible flares marching across the dark in a line. 40 names that would need to be crossed off the deepest charts of the Dominion. The largest concentration of folding power ever assembled was unmade by its own fold, handed back all at once by a single ship that had simply chosen to hold the weight a little longer than the Armada could. The 2,000 cruisers and escorts were not folded. The returning tide was tuned, by Doyle's order and the Heart's careful work, to fold the heavy and spare the light, to find the engines and pass the smaller ships by. The cruisers were scattered. They were thrown back, tumbling, their fields disrupted, their crews shaken, their formation torn to ribbons. But they were not crushed. The standing mountain let them live. 2,000 ships of the Dominion's proud military caste, scattered and broken and alive, exactly as she had let the one engine live in the seventh reach. Because the message was the same, only larger now, only impossible to mistake. The humans were not here to fold the Dominion. They were here to prove that they could, and to let the Dominion live with the proof. When it was over, the standing mountain stood once more alone in the dark, gently giving the last of the borrowed weight back to space, smoothing the slope, becoming again only a ship. Around her, 2,000 scattered cruisers fled in every direction, carrying home the second truth, the larger truth, the truth that not even 40 engines were enough, that the captured Heart had no bottom they could reach, that the standing mountain could drink any fold the Dominion could pour and hand all of it back. Of the 2,000 cruisers and escorts that fled the death of the Ninth Folding Armada, the one that carried the truth deepest was a small escort named in the Dominion's records only by a number, and crewed by a young weapons reader named Pell-On, who had never before been in a battle and who would never, for the rest of a long life, be able to stop describing this one. Pell-On had been stationed at the rear of the Armada, far from the front, in the place the youngest and least tested crews were always put. From there, through her instruments, she had watched the whole thing, and her instruments had recorded it all, and the recording she carried out of that dark was the clearest single account the Dominion would ever have of what the standing mountain truly was. She had watched 40 engines reach out together. She had watched the human ship glow at its edges and begin to drink. She had watched the readings climb and climb, the captured heart growing heavier than anything her instruments had ever measured, and she had waited, the way her whole crew had waited, for the human ship to reach its limit, to strain, to crack, to break the way matter always broke when 40 engines bore down on it. It never reached its limit. That was the thing Pell-On could not stop describing afterward, the thing that woke her in the dark for years. There was no limit. The human ship drank 40 engines and showed no more strain at the 40th than it had at the first. Her instruments, built to measure the breaking point of matter, simply ran out of numbers. The captured heart went past every threshold the Dominion's science had ever defined, past the weight of a star, past the weight of a folded world, past everything, and it did not break, and it did not even seem to notice that it was supposed to. And then it gave the weight back, and Pell-On watched 40 engines die in a wave that crossed the formation in less than a minute, 40 small, terrible flares marching across the dark in a line, and she watched her own escort, and every other small ship in the Armada, be deliberately and precisely spared. That was the second thing she could not stop describing. The Dreadnought chose. In the very moment it unmade 40 world killers, it reached out across 2,000 smaller ships and spared every one of them, tuned its returning tide to find the heavy and pass the light, killed the weapons and let the crews live. It was not the mercy of a thing that could not finish the job. It was the mercy of a thing that could have folded all of them as easily as it folded the engines, and chose, in the same breath, not to. Pell-On was a weapons reader. She understood weapons, and she understood, watching the standing mountain spare her, that she was looking at the most controlled use of force she had ever seen, or ever would. A blunt weapon kills everything. A precise weapon kills exactly what it means to, and nothing else. The human ship had just demonstrated, in a single minute, more precision than the entire Dominion had managed in 4,000 years of folding, and it had used that precision not to kill more, but to kill less, to take the 40 things that needed taking and leave 2,000 things that did not. She flew home shaking, her crew flew home shaking, and the recording she carried, the clean, clear account of 40 engines dying in a line while 2,000 ships were spared, became the thing that finally, slowly, began to turn the Dominion's mind. Because the Spiral could dismiss one cruiser captain's report, it could dismiss a messenger engine's plea, it could file the loss of 2 engines in the Sevath Reach as a tactical anomaly and the loss of 40 more as a tragic miscalculation. But it could not, in the end, dismiss 2,000 survivors all carrying the same recording, all telling the same impossible story, all spared by the same hand. The truth was no longer a rumor from the forward dark. It was 2,000 eyewitnesses, and they had all seen the same thing, and the thing they had seen could not be unseen. The younger officers were the first to break. They were the ones who had flown in the Ninth Folding Armada, the ones who had been spared, and they had looked the human dreadnought in the face, and felt it choose to let them live, and they could not go back to believing the old certainties after that. They began to talk among themselves, quietly at first, in the way frightened young people talk when the old people above them refuse to listen. They began to ask the question the Spiral did not want asked. If 40 engines were not enough, what number would be? And if no number was enough, what was the point of gathering numbers at all? The cruiser captain Sail Threvar, who had understood the truth in the seventh reach and been ignored, found the young officers, or perhaps they found him, the way the few who see a thing clearly always find one another in a crowd insisting they are wrong. He showed them his report, the one that had been filed and forgotten. They showed him Pelon's recording, and together, slowly, they began to build the thing the Dominion would need if it was going to survive what was coming, which was not a weapon and not a fleet, but a single small fragile idea that no fold could crush. The idea was this. The war was already over. The only question left was how the Dominion would lose it. It could lose it by feeding engine after engine into the human ship until there were no engines left, until the source itself was gone, until the Dominion's whole power was scattered as scars across the dark. Or it could lose it by listening, by stopping, by accepting that the slope went both ways now and learning, for the first time in 4,000 years, to live in a dark it did not own. One of those losses was survivable, the other was not, and the young officers and the old captain who had seen it first set themselves quietly to the work of making the spiral choose the loss it could live with, before the spiral, in its pride, chose the one it could not. They were too late to save the first engine. The spiral had already decided the problem was the ship, and was already reaching, in its long blindness, for the one weapon it had sworn never to use. But they were not too late to save what came after. When the first engine was gone, and the chamber that held it was a hole in the heart of the high spiral, when the last of the old certainties was finally, undeniably dead, it was Sel Threvar and Pelon and the young officers they had gathered, who were ready, who had already done the thinking, who could step into the silence the dead certainties left behind and say the words the spiral had refused to hear from anyone else. The slope goes both ways. We cannot win. Let us lose the way that lets us keep our worlds. But that was still to come. First the spiral had to lose its first engine. First it had to learn, the hardest possible way, that even the oldest and deepest fold in the dark could be handed back. And the standing mountain, standing quiet beyond the seventh reach, was about to teach it exactly that. Far away, in the high spiral, the oldest authority in the galaxy received the news of the ninth folding armada, and made its third mistake, which was the worst one, and the last one it would have the chance to make. It decided the problem was the ship. The spiral reasoned that if one dreadnought could do this, then the dreadnought itself was the threat, a single impossible hull that had to be removed at any cost. It did not yet understand that the dreadnought was not a single impossible hull at all. It was a demonstration. It was a lesson the humans had built so that the Dominion would learn it without having to be destroyed. And the spiral, in its long pride, refused to learn the lesson, and reached instead for the one weapon it had left, the weapon it had been holding in reserve for 4,000 years, the weapon it had sworn never to use except against an enemy that threatened the Dominion's existence itself. It woke the first engine. The first engine was the oldest of all the collapse engines, the original, the one from which all the others had been copied across 4,000 years. It was not the size of a small moon. It was the size of a large one. It had folded the very first world the Dominion had ever folded, in the deep past before the Dominion had even been the Dominion, and it had slept in the heart of the high spiral ever since, too powerful and too dangerous to use, waiting for an enemy worthy of it. The spiral had finally found one. It woke the first engine, and it pointed it toward the dark beyond the seventh reach, toward the single 9-kilometer hull that had unmade 2 armadas, and it prepared to fold the human dreadnought with a weight no captured copy could ever match, a weight from the original, the source, the deepest fold the Dominion had ever been able to make. The first engine opened its ancient field, and the dark for 1,000 lengths around it bent and screamed, and the high spiral felt, for the first time in 4,000 years, something almost like hope. It should not have hoped. It had forgotten the simplest thing, the thing the mapmaker Elon Sef had understood at the very beginning, alone at his marker, with 3 words. The captured heart in the standing mountain's belly was not a copy of the first engine. It was the first engine's child, yes, like all the others. But it had spent 11 years in human hands, being asked questions no engine had ever been asked, being taught to do a thing no engine had ever done, and it knew its oldest parent's voice. It knew the first engine's fold the way a child knows a parent's footstep in the dark. When the first engine woke and began to reach across the galaxy toward the standing mountain, the captured heart did not feel fear. It felt recognition. And on the bridge of the dreadnought, Captain Imogen Doyle felt the heart in her ship's belly grow very still and very attentive, the way a thing goes still when it hears, after a long time, a voice it has been waiting its whole life to answer. The first engine reached across the galaxy, and the reach itself was a kind of folding. It did not need to be close to bite. It was old enough and deep enough that it could fold a thing from very far away, slowly, drawing the dark itself between it and its target into a long, tightening channel, like a throat closing around what it meant to swallow. The standing mountain felt the channel begin to close around her, and she did not run. Captain Imogen Doyle had not slept in 4 days now. She stood at the long window of real hull and she watched the distant stars begin to smear and tilt as the first engine's reach found her ship and began to draw the dark tight. She had read everything the human engineers had written about the first engine, which was not much, because no one had ever captured one, because there was only one and it had never left the heart of the Dominion until now. She knew her ship had drunk 3 engines and survived, and 40 engines and survived, and she did not know, no one knew, whether her ship could drink the original, the source, the deepest fold ever made. She did not have to know. The captured heart knew, and the captured heart was the part of the ship that would do the drinking, and the captured heart was not afraid. Doyle had learned, in the years she had spent flying a ship built around an ancient alien thing, to listen to it. Not to its words, because it had no words she could hear, but to its weight, the way it sat in the ship, the way it leaned and steadied and breathed. And in the moment the first engine's reach closed around the standing mountain, Doyle felt the captured heart do something it had never done in all the years she had flown with it. She felt it lean forward. It wanted this. After 11 years of being studied, of being asked careful questions in a deep, cold yard, of being pointed at copies of itself, and made to drink their folds, the captured heart had finally heard its oldest parent's voice, and it leaned toward that voice, the way a thing leans toward home. It did not want to flee the first engine's fold, it wanted to answer it. So Doyle let it. She gave no order this time. There was no order to give. She only stood at the window and let the heart do what it had spent 11 years preparing to do, and she watched the dark. The first engine's reach closed fully. The deepest fold the Dominion had ever made poured into the standing mountain, and it was unlike the folds of the copies, deeper and older and stranger, a weight that did not merely press but pulled, that did not merely crush but unmade, that had been folding worlds since before the Dominion had a name. It poured into the captured heart, and for a long, terrible moment, even the heart strained. Even the heart that had drunk 40 engines and not broken, even it bent under the weight of the thing that had made it. And then the captured heart did the thing no engine had ever done to the first engine. It recognized the fold. It knew the shape of it, because it was its parent's shape, because it had been made in that shape 4,000 years ago. And knowing the shape, it did not have to drink the whole weight blindly, the way it had drunk the copies. It could fold the weight back along the exact channel it had come down, back up the closing throat, back along the first engine's own reach, all the way home to the source. The standing mountain gave the first engine's fold back to the first engine. It did not give it back the way it had given back the copies, in a line or a tide. It gave it back along the first engine's own channel, the long throat the original had opened across the galaxy to swallow the dreadnought, and it sent the whole deep ancient fold rushing back up that throat toward the thing that had made it, faster than the first engine could close the channel, faster than the high spiral could understand what was happening. In the heart of the Dominion, in the deepest chamber of the high spiral, the first engine felt its own fold returning up its own reach, and it tried to do the one thing that might save it. It tried to let go of the channel, to release its hold on the dark between itself and the human ship, to break the throat before the returning fold could climb all the way home. It was too slow. It was 4,000 years old, and it had never once needed to be fast, because nothing it had ever folded had folded back. The returning fold reached the source before the source could let go. The first engine folded. The oldest collapse engine in existence, the original, the source of all the Dominion's power, the thing that had folded the first world before the Dominion had a name, drew itself inward along its own returned fold and collapsed down to a single point in the deepest chamber of the high spiral. It did not flare quietly the way the copies had flared. It was too large and too old for that. When it folded, it took the chamber with it, and a good part of the high spiral around the chamber, drawing the ancient seat of Dominion authority inward toward the point where the first engine had been, until the oldest building in the galaxy had a hole in its heart, the shape of the weapon it had kept there for 4,000 years. The high spiral survived, most of its mines survived, but the first engine did not, and the chamber did not, and the 4,000-year certainty that the Dominion held the deepest fold in the dark did not survive either. The deepest fold in the dark had just been handed back to its source by a single human ship, and the source had not been able to hold it. The standing mountain stood in the dark beyond the seventh reach, having drunk and returned the deepest fold ever made, and she was still there, still whole, 9 kilometers of dark hull standing quiet, where a moment before the original of all the Dominion's weapons had reached across the galaxy to swallow her. On her bridge, Captain Imogen Doyle felt the captured heart settle back, slow and steady, satisfied in a way she had never felt it before. It had answered its parent's voice. It had given the first engine's fold back to the first engine, and the first engine was gone, and the heart that had been a captive in a human ship for 11 years was, for the first time, the oldest and deepest fold left in all the dark. Doyle understood, standing at the window, that the war was over, not because the Dominion had been destroyed, because it had not, not because the Dominion would surrender, because it had not, yet, but because the one thing the Dominion had believed for 4,000 years, the thing it had built its entire empire upon, was now simply and finally untrue. The Dominion had believed that the fold could only go one way, that a thing folded could never fold back, that to hold the deepest weight was to hold the dark itself. And in the space of 3 battles, a single human dreadnought had folded a collapse engine, then 40 collapse engines, then the first engine itself, all of them using nothing but the Dominion's own weight handed back. There was nothing left for the Dominion to believe in. Every weapon it had was now a weapon that could be turned. Every fold it might make was now a fold that might be returned. The slope went both ways, completely and forever, and the humans had proven it 3 times, each time larger, each time more impossible, each time letting the Dominion live so that it would have to carry the proof. The high spiral, wounded, its ancient chamber a hole in its heart, gathered what was left of its old minds, and did the thing it had never once done in 4,000 years. It asked to talk. The request came to the standing mountain in the flat old machine tongue, carried by the same surviving engine from the seventh reach, the one Doyle had let live at the very beginning, the one that had been a messenger ever since. The request was short. The spiral did not know how to ask for things it had only ever taken, but it managed, in its broken old way, to send 3 words of its own across the dark to the human ship that had unmade everything it believed. The request said, "What do you want?" Captain Imogen Doyle read the translation, and she stood at the long window for a while, looking at the dark she had defended and the wounded empire that had finally, after 4,000 years and 3 battles, learned to be afraid. And she thought about Aldra's Rest, the colony world the Dominion had come to fold, the 11,000 people who had climbed an impossible slope in suits that screamed, who had captured the heart that now beat in her ship's belly, who had bought this moment with 200 lives and 11 years of patient work in a cold, deep yard. She thought about what they would have wanted her to ask for, and then she answered the high spiral, in the old machine tongue, the captured heart translating her words and sending them home, and her answer was not the answer of a conqueror, because the humans had not come to conquer. It was the answer of a species that had been marked for folding and had instead climbed the slope, and it was the only answer that the 4,000 years of folding deserved. She said, "Stop folding worlds, That is all. Stop, and we let you keep yours. Not every mind in the high spiral was ready to say yes, and one of them was not ready to stop at all. There was an old authority in the spiral called the Deep Warden, the mind that had overseen the folding of more worlds than any other, and the Deep Warden could not accept what the human ship had done. It had spent its whole long existence certain that the fold was the final word in the dark, that nothing could outlast it, that to hold the deepest weight was to hold the last argument. The death of the first engine had not taught the Deep Warden the lesson. It had only made the old mind desperate, and a desperate 4,000-year-old certainty is a dangerous thing. While the rest of the spiral debated the human captain's terms, the Deep Warden moved in secret. It still had access to a thing the Dominion had built long ago and never used, a thing called the Convergence, a way of linking many smaller engines across many systems into a single distributed fold, so that worlds spread light years apart could be drawn down together. The Convergence had never been tested at full scale, because it had never been needed, because a single engine had always been enough. The Deep Warden gathered what engines the Dominion had left, the survivors and the reserves, 11 of them in all, scattered across 11 systems, and it linked them through the Convergence, and it pointed the whole distributed fold at the one place it believed could still end the human threat. It did not point the Convergence at the Standing Mountain. It had learned that much. It pointed the Convergence at the Deep Yard, at the human home, at the cold, quiet place where the second and third dreadnoughts were being built, where the survivors of Aldra's Rest lived and worked, where the captured heart had been studied for 11 years. The Deep Warden reasoned that it could not fold the dreadnought, but it might still fold the place that made dreadnoughts, and so end the threat at its root before a fleet of standing mountains could be born. It was a clever plan, and a cruel one, and it very nearly worked, because the Standing Mountain was far away beyond the seventh reach, 11 systems distant from the home she had come from, and there was no other ship in the dark that could drink a fold. But the captured heart felt the Convergence form. It was the oldest fold left in the galaxy now, and it was sensitive to the folds of its lesser kin the way a deep bell is sensitive to the ringing of smaller ones. When 11 engines linked through the Convergence and began to draw their distributed fold toward the Deep Yard, the captured heart in the Standing Mountain's belly heard it, faint and far away, the way a parent hears a child cry from across a house. And on the bridge, 11 systems from home, Captain Imogen Doyle felt the heart go suddenly tense, and she knew, without being told, that something was reaching for the thing she had come all this way to protect. She did not have time to fly home. The Deep Yard was 11 systems away, and even the Standing Mountain could not cross 11 systems before a fold that had already begun could finish. So she did the thing the humans had been studying in the cold for 11 years, the thing they had hoped never to need, the thing the captured heart had been quietly learning to do all along. She did not fly to the fold. She reached for it. The captured heart, the oldest and deepest fold in the dark, did to the Convergence what the first engine had tried to do to the Standing Mountain. It reached across the systems, found the linked fold of the 11 engines, and took hold of the channel they had opened. The long thread of folding force stretched across 11 systems toward the Deep Yard, and it pulled the other way. The Deep Warden's Convergence had been built to draw 11 systems worth of fold toward a single point. The captured heart simply reversed the draw. It seized the distributed fold and turned it back, not toward the Deep Yard, but back along its own threads toward the 11 engines that were making it. The same trick it had used on the first engine, only spread now across 11 systems at once, 11 channels reversed in the same breath. The 11 engines of the Convergence felt their own fold returning up their own threads, and they tried, all 11 of them, to let go, and they were all of them too slow, because they were copies, and copies had never needed to be fast. One after another, across 11 systems, the 11 engines of the Deep Warden's last gamble folded down to points along their own returned threads, 11 small flares blooming in 11 different darks, 11 names crossed off the Dominion's charts in the time it took the captured heart, 11 systems away, to finish a single steady pull. The Deep Yard was never touched. The survivors of Aldra's Rest never knew, until afterward, how close the fold had come. The second and third dreadnoughts went on growing in the cold, unharmed. And the Deep Warden, the old mind that could not accept the lesson, found that it had thrown away the last 11 engines of the Dominion for nothing, that it had proven the human captain's point one final and total time, that there was now no fold anywhere in the dark, distributed or singular, near or far, that the captured heart could not reach across space and turn back upon its maker. The Deep Warden had wanted to end the threat at its root. Instead, it had cut away the very last of the Dominion's power, and handed the humans a victory so complete that even the proudest mind in the spiral could no longer pretend the war was anything but lost. That was the thing that finally ended the debate. Not the death of the first engine, but the death of the last 11, thrown away by an old mind too stubborn to stop. With them gone, the Dominion had almost no engines left at all, and the ones it had it dared not use, because every fold was now a fold that came back. The argument for fighting on had folded itself into a point along with the Deep Warden's convergence, and what was left was only the human captain's quiet terms, waiting in the dark for an answer. The Void Shaper High Spiral took 11 days to answer, and in those 11 days the dark beyond the Sevath Reach was very quiet, because the standing mountains simply waited, and a wounded empire learned what it was like to wait on someone else's answer, for the first time in 4,000 years. When the answer came, it was a single word in the old machine tongue, and the captured heart translated it, and the translation was, yes. The Dominion stopped folding worlds, not all at once, and not without argument among its old minds, and not because it had grown kind, because it had not. It stopped because a single human dreadnought had proven, 3 times and at growing scale, that every fold the Dominion made could now be made to fold back, and that the species which had learned this trick had chosen, each time, not to use it to destroy the Dominion, but only to make it stop. An empire can fight an enemy that wants to destroy it. The Dominion had 4,000 years of practice at that. It did not know how to fight an enemy that had it utterly at its mercy and wanted only for it to stop hurting worlds. There was no weapon for that. There was no fold for that. There was only the long, uncomfortable understanding that the dark had changed, and that the Dominion would have to change with it, or be folded by its own weight. So it stopped. Mapmaker Elon Sef, far back at his lonely marker, was among the first to learn it officially. The order came down the chain to redraw every chart, to mark no more worlds for folding, to record the inhabited systems not as future scars but as places that would go on existing. Elon Sef had been quietly redrawing his own charts since the day he watched the standing mountains stand whole in the dark, and so the order found him already at work, already drawing a galaxy with its worlds left on. He drew for the rest of his career, and the charts he made were the first in 4,000 years that added places instead of crossing them off, and he was prouder of them than of anything he had ever drawn. The standing mountain went home. She did not go home in triumph, with banners and broadcasts, because that was not how the humans who built her did things. She went home quietly, 9 kilometers of dark hull crossing the long dark back toward human space, her captured heart settled and steady in her belly, the oldest and deepest fold left in all the galaxy now beating gently inside a ship that had no intention of ever folding a world again. Captain Imogen Doyle finally slept, somewhere in the long crossing, and when she woke she found that the dread she had carried for 4 days and 3 battles had eased into something quieter, something that was not quite peace but was at least the absence of fear. She brought the ship home to the deep yard where she had been built, the cold, quiet place far from any star where the humans had spent 11 years learning the secrets of the captured heart. And there, waiting at the yard, was the thing that made the whole long war worth the cost, the thing the records of the 3 battles never mention because the records were about folds and weights and dying engines, and this was not about any of those. Waiting at the yard were the survivors of Aldra's Rest. They had not died when their world was marked for folding. They had climbed the slope. 200 had died in the climbing, but the rest had lived, the ones who captured the heart, the ones who turned off the fold and towed the half-living engine home. 11,000 people, minus the 200, had been brought off their dying world before the fold could finish, evacuated in the long year while their own people climbed the collapse engine to save them. They had spent the 11 years since in the deep yard and the colonies near it, watching the humans build a ship around the heart they had captured, watching it grow from a frame to a hull to a 9-kilometer dreadnought, waiting to see whether their impossible climb would mean anything in the end. It had meant everything. The heart they captured had folded the first engine. The slope they climbed had become the lesson that stopped 4,000 years of folding. And when the standing mountain came home to the deep yard, the people of Aldra's Rest were waiting at the docks, 10,800 of them, to meet the ship that carried the heart they had given their world to capture. Among them was an old man named Garen Voss. He had been one of the first up the slope, all those years ago, one of the climbers in the screaming suits, and he had lost his brother on the climb, one of the 200 who did not make it to the top. He had spent 11 years in the deep yard, working in the cold, watching the dreadnought grow, never quite sure whether his brother's death had bought anything at all. And when the standing mountain came home, carrying the heart his brother had died to capture, Garen Voss stood at the dock and watched her settle into the yard, 9 kilometers of dark hull that had unmade the empire that took his world, and he understood at last what his brother had bought. He had bought this: the ship, the heart, the lesson, the stopping, the galaxy where worlds would no longer be crossed off charts. His brother had climbed a slope that killed him, so that, 11 years later, a captain named Imogen Doyle could stand at a window and tell an ancient empire to stop and have it obey. That was what the 200 had bought. That was what the climb had meant. Captain Doyle came down from the ship to meet them, and she found Garen Voss in the crowd, because she had read the records of Aldra's Rest 100 times and she knew the names of the climbers, and she went to the old man, and she did not salute him, and she did not make a speech. She only took his hand, the hand of a man who had climbed an impossible slope and lost his brother doing it, and she told him, quietly, what the heart had done, how it had drunk 3 engines and 40 engines and the first engine itself, how it had answered its parent's voice, how it had folded the deepest fold in the dark, back up its own throat, and unmade the source of all the folding. She told him that the heart his brother died to capture had ended the folding forever, and that the galaxy was full of worlds tonight that would have been scars, and that every one of them owed their existence, whether they knew it or not, to 200 people who climbed a slope in screaming suits a long time ago. Garen Voss did not say much. There was not much to say, but he stood a little straighter after that, and he went back to the deep yard the next day, and he kept working, because there were 2 more dreadnoughts taking shape in the cold, the second and the third, and the humans were not foolish enough to believe that a single yes from a wounded empire was the same as forever. They built the second and the third the way they had built the standing mountain, slow and careful and patient, around the lessons the first had taught, and they kept them ready, and they hoped they would never have to wake them. They never did. The Dominion kept its yes. Perhaps it kept it out of wisdom, or perhaps only out of fear, and in the end it did not much matter which, because a world spared by a frightened empire is just as spared as a world spared by a kind one. The folding stopped, and stayed stopped, and the charts of the dark slowly filled with worlds instead of scars, and the species that had spent 4,000 years afraid of nothing learned to live, carefully and forever, beside a species that had handed it back its own deepest weapon and then chosen, every time, not to use it. In the years after, the dark settled into a shape no one living had ever seen, a dark in which the Void Shaper Dominion still existed and still ruled its old core, and still held its proud military caste, and yet had stopped, completely and forever, the one thing it had been built to do. It was the cruiser captain Sail Thravar and the weapons reader Pel On who managed the stopping, more than anyone. When the first engine died and the spiral finally fell silent, it was the 2 of them, with the young officers they had gathered, who stepped into that silence and gave it words. They did not seize power. The Dominion did not work that way, and they were not the kind to want it. They simply became the ones the wounded spiral turned to, because they were the ones who had understood the thing in time, and an empire that has just learned it was wrong about everything will reach, in its shame, for whoever was right. They told the spiral the truth plainly. The war is over. We lost it the day the human ship drank the first fold. Every engine we send now is an engine we throw away. The only choice left is whether we keep our worlds or feed them, one engine at a time, into a ship that cannot be filled. And the spiral, for the first time in 4,000 years, listened to a thing it did not want to hear, because the thing it wanted to hear had just been folded into a point in the deepest chamber of its own house. So the Dominion stopped, and Sel Thravar, who had held his cruiser in the dark and watched the standing mountain instead of fleeing her, spent the rest of his long life as something the Dominion had never had before, a keeper of the new understanding, a teacher of the lesson the humans had taught at such cost. He did not teach hatred of the humans. He taught the opposite. He taught that the humans had had the Dominion utterly at their mercy, 3 times, and had chosen each time to spare it, and that a power which spares you when it could end you is not a power you fight, it is a power you learn from. He taught the young of the military caste that the highest skill was not the fold but the choice, the precision the human ship had shown when it killed 40 engines and spared 2,000 ships, the discipline to take only what needed taking and leave the rest alive. It was, the Dominion came to understand slowly, the same lesson the humans had built the standing mountain to teach. The fold goes both ways now, and in a dark where the fold goes both ways, the only safe way to live is to use your weight gently, to spare what you can, to leave the worlds alone. The humans had not conquered the Dominion. They had done something stranger and far more lasting. They had made the Dominion want, for its own survival, to become a little more like them. On the human side, the homecoming of the standing mountain did not end at the dock with Garen Voss. The old man went back to the deep yard the next day, as he had told himself he would, and he worked on the 2nd and 3rd dreadnoughts, and he was, for the first time in 11 years, at peace with the work, because now he knew what the work was for. But the part of the story the records never told, the part that mattered most to the people of Aldra's Rest, came later, and it came quietly, and it was the reason Captain Imogen Doyle had truly brought the ship home. She had brought the heart home. Not the captured heart in the ship's belly, which would stay there forever. The oldest fold in the dark, beating gentle in a human hull. She had brought home a different thing, a thing the survivors of Aldra's Rest had been waiting 11 years to learn. She had brought home the answer to the question they had never let themselves ask out loud in all those years of building in the cold. Was it worth it? The 200 who died on the slope, the world they lost, the 11 years of work, was any of it worth it, or had they only delayed their own ending? It was worth it. That was the answer Doyle carried home, and it was the answer the whole long war had been about. The 200 who climbed the slope and died had not died for nothing. They had captured the heart that ended the folding. They had bought, with their lives, a galaxy in which no other world would ever be folded the way Aldra's Rest had been folded. There were worlds out there in the dark, thousands of them, that would have been scars by now, that would have been crossed off the Dominion's charts, that were instead going on, full of life, full of people who would never know the names of the 200 climbers who had bought them there tomorrow. Doyle made sure the people of Aldra's Rest knew that. She made sure the names of the 200 were carved, not on a wall of the dead, but on the hull of the standing mountain herself, the ship the captured heart had become a part of, so that the climbers who had bought the lesson would ride forever in the ship that had taught it. And when the dreadnought stood her long, quiet watch at the edge of human space in the years that followed, she carried those 200 names out into the dark with her, and any power in the galaxy that scanned her and read her hull would read, among the human script, 200 names it could not translate, and would never know that it was looking at the price of its own safety. Garen Voss lived long enough to see his brother's name carved into the hull. He stood at the dock again, an old man now, older than he had been at the first homecoming, and he watched the standing mountain ease out into the dark to begin a patrol, and he saw his brother's name go with her, out into the long night, into the galaxy his brother had died to save. And he did not weep, because the time for weeping had passed 11 years before, on the slope. He only watched, the way the mapmaker Elon Sef had once watched, the way small things watch large and quiet things move through the dark, and he understood, all the way down, what his brother had bought. His brother had bought this: the ship, the watch, the spared worlds, the stopped folding, the changed dark, the galaxy where the charts filled with worlds instead of scars. All of it, every part of it, bought on a slope, by people who climbed in screaming suits toward a thing that should have killed them, and did kill some of them, and was captured anyway, and turned around, and pointed back. The standing mountain went out into the dark, and the 200 names went with her, and the galaxy went on beneath her quiet watch, and the empire that had once stared at her in horror learned, slowly and forever, to be grateful she had come. The standing mountain did not fight again. She did not need to. She had done the only thing she was ever built to do, which was not to win a war, but to end one. To stand alone before everything an empire could pour at her, and drink all of it, and hand it back, and let the empire live with the knowing. She became, in the years after, a kind of quiet guardian of the long dark, 9 kilometers of hull standing watch at the edge of human space, with the oldest fold in the galaxy beating gentle in her belly, and the sight of her on a far scope was enough, on its own, to make any power in the dark think very carefully about whatever it had been about to do. Mapmaker Elon Sef met her once, late in his life. His charts had earned him a place on a survey ship, and the survey ship's route passed near the edge of human space, and there she was, on his far scope, the shape he had tagged as an anomaly so many years ago, the shape his instruments had insisted should fall. He looked at her for a long time. He remembered the 3 words he had sent up the chain at the very beginning, the truest words anyone in the Dominion ever spoke about that day, the words that turned out to be a question the universe had answered with a single dark hull. This should fall. It had not fallen. It still had not fallen. It stood at the edge of the dark, quiet and whole, the heart of the old empire beating in the chest of the new one, and Elon Sef understood at last that some things in the dark were not measured but met, and that the difference between the two had been the whole lesson, and that it had cost an empire 4,000 years of pride and 200 climbers their lives, and that it had been, in the end, worth every part of the price. He drew her on his chart before the survey ship moved on. He did not mark her as a threat, or a scar, or a thing to be folded. He drew her the way the humans would have wanted, the way she truly was. He drew her as a place, a fixed point in the dark, a thing that held, a mountain that stood, and beside her he wrote not the clipped script of the Mapmaker Corps, but 2 plain words in the human tongue he had finally taken the trouble to learn, 2 words that said everything the readings never could: still standing. And the galaxy went on, full of worlds that should have been scars, beneath the quiet watch of a dreadnought that had stared down an empire and never once needed to fall, and the empire that had stared back in horror on the day it first saw her had long since learned the only lesson that mattered in the new dark the humans had made. That the fold goes both ways now, that it always would, and that the safest thing any power could do, in a galaxy with the standing mountain in it, was simply to leave the worlds alone and let the charts keep filling, and be grateful, every quiet day, that the heaviest thing in the dark had chosen to be a guardian instead of a grave.